In the third-floor girls' bathroom at Riverside High School, 17-year-old Emma Chen found herself face-to-face with her worst nightmare. Jessica Martinez and her crew had cornered her by the sinks, their eyes gleaming with malicious intent as they dragged her toward the nearest toilet stall. What started as another day of harassment was about to become something far more sinister as they forced her head toward the murky water, determined to make her drink from the bowl. But Jessica had no idea that the quiet girl she was tormenting had been trained by one of the military's most elite combat instructors. In 30 seconds, the roles would reverse completely, and these bullies would be the ones begging for mercy. What deadly skills had Emma been hiding all along? You won't believe how this shy student transformed into a lethal weapon right before their eyes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma Chen had perfected the art of being forgettable. At 17, she moved through the hallways of Riverside High School in Bakersfield, California, like smoke through fingers. Her petite frame was always wrapped in oversized sweaters that hung loose on her shoulders, and her long black hair fell like a curtain across her face, hiding her sharp brown eyes from the world. She kept her head down, clutching her worn leather messenger bag close to her chest, navigating the crowded corridors with practiced precision to avoid drawing attention. Riverside High was a monument to athletic achievement, its trophy cases gleaming with decades of swimming, football, and wrestling championships. Here muscle meant status, and Emma possessed neither the towering height of the volleyball players nor the broad shoulders of the soccer stars. She was just another face in the crowd of 3,000 students, which was exactly how she preferred it. What none of them knew was that beneath her baggy clothes and quiet demeanor lay a secret that would have shattered their perceptions entirely. The secret had died with her father 8 months ago. Master Sergeant David Chen had been a decorated Marine Corps combat instructor, a man who could take down opponents twice his size with movements so fluid they looked like a deadly dance. He had started training Emma when she was 7 years old, not because he wanted to create a fighter, but because he wanted to ensure his daughter would never be anyone's victim. Every morning before school, they would spend 2 hours in their garage, which he had converted into a private dojo complete with heavy bags, wooden training dummies, and mats that had absorbed years of sweat and determination. David had taught her Krav Maga for practical self-defense, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for ground combat, and Muay Thai for striking techniques. By the time she turned 15, Emma could disarm an attacker wielding a knife, break free from any hold, and incapacitate someone twice her size using pressure points and joint manipulation. Her father had been proud of her progress, but he had also warned her about the responsibility that came with such knowledge. Violence was never the first option, he had told her repeatedly. It was the last resort when all other paths had been exhausted. When David died in a training accident at Camp Pendleton, Emma's world collapsed. Her mother, Sarah, had been so overwhelmed with grief and financial stress that she decided they needed a fresh start somewhere new. They moved from their comfortable home in San Francisco to a modest apartment in Bakersfield, where Sarah found work as a nurse at the local hospital. Emma made a conscious decision to bury her fighting skills along with her father's memory. She wanted to be normal, to blend in, to avoid the kind of attention that her abilities might bring. The irony was not lost on her that in trying to avoid conflict, she had made herself a target for those who thrived on it. Jessica Martinez had spotted Emma's vulnerability within the first week of school, like a predator sensing wounded prey. Jessica was everything Emma was not: tall, confident, and commanding. She had flowing auburn hair that caught the light perfectly, green eyes that could shift from charming to cruel in an instant, and a smile that could cut through steel when she wanted to inflict damage. As the captain of the swim team and daughter of a prominent local businessman, Jessica ruled Riverside High's social hierarchy with an iron fist wrapped in designer clothes. Her two constant companions were Chloe Roberts and Ashley Thompson, both swimmers who had attached themselves to Jessica's success like barnacles on a ship's hull. Chloe was a redhead with freckles and a laugh that sounded like breaking glass, while Ashley was blonde and perpetually tanned, with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from never having been told no. Together, they formed a triangle of torment that had perfected the art of making other students' lives miserable while maintaining their pristine reputations with the faculty. Emma's harassment had started subtly. Jessica would bump into her in the hallways, causing her to drop her books while offering fake apologies. Chloe would make loud comments about Emma's thrift store clothes when she passed their table in the cafeteria. Ashley would accidentally step on Emma's feet during passing periods, then act surprised when Emma stumbled. The attacks were calculated to be just below the radar of teachers and administrators, cruel enough to cause pain, but subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability. As the weeks turned into months, the harassment escalated. They started following Emma to her locker, surrounding her while she tried to gather her books, making comments about her dead father that cut deeper than any physical blow. They would wait for her after school, blocking her path to the bus while making crude jokes about her appearance and her family's financial struggles. Emma endured it all in silence, remembering her father's lessons about choosing battles wisely and never using violence unless absolutely necessary. The turning point came on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon in late April. Emma had stayed after school in the library computer lab, working on a research paper about military history. The assignment was particularly meaningful to her because it gave her a chance to honor her father's memory through academic work rather than physical confrontation. She had become absorbed in reading about famous military strategists, losing track of time as she always did when studying topics that connected her to David's legacy. The library was nearly empty when she finally saved her work and gathered her belongings. The late buses had already left, which meant she would have to walk the 3 miles home through neighborhoods that grew rougher as they approached her apartment complex. Emma shouldered her messenger bag and headed for the nearest bathroom before beginning her trek home. She had no way of knowing that Jessica and her crew had been watching her, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. The third-floor girls' bathroom near the gymnasium was notorious among students for being a blind spot in the school's security coverage. The cameras in the hallway couldn't see inside, and the location was far enough from the main offices that screams would go unheard. Emma pushed open the heavy door, her sneakers squeaking against the white tiles as she stepped inside. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the empty stalls, and the air smelled of industrial cleaning supplies, mixed with the chlorine that drifted up from the pool area below. She was halfway to the nearest stall when she heard the door swing shut behind her with a definitive click. Emma turned, her heart already beginning to race, and saw Jessica, Chloe, and Ashley standing between her and the only exit. They had changed out of their school clothes into their swim team warm-ups, and their hair was still damp from practice. Jessica's green eyes were bright with anticipation, and her smile was the kind that belonged on a predator that had just cornered its prey. "Well, well, well," Jessica said, her voice echoing off the tiles. "Look what we have here." Little Emma Chen, all alone with nowhere to run. She took a step forward, and Emma instinctively backed toward the sinks, her mind racing through possible escape routes. There were none. The bathroom had only one door, and 3 athletes stood between her and freedom. Chloe giggled, twirling a wet strand of red hair around her finger. "We've been talking, Emma, and we've decided it's time you learned your place in this school." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her voice carried the kind of casual cruelty that suggested this was just another Tuesday afternoon activity for her. Ashley cracked her knuckles, the sound sharp and threatening in the enclosed space. "You think you're better than us, don't you? Walking around here like you're some kind of mystery girl. Well, we're done with the mysterious act." She moved to flank Emma's left side while Chloe positioned herself on the right, creating a human cage with Jessica as the focal point. Emma's training kicked in automatically, her body shifting into a defensive stance so subtly that the three girls didn't even notice. She could feel her father's presence in her mind, his voice calm and instructive even in this moment of extreme danger. Assess the threats, identify the leader, look for weaknesses, create distance when possible. But another part of her mind, the part that had been trying so hard to be normal, screamed at her to find a peaceful solution. "I don't want any trouble," Emma said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I just want to go home." She kept her hands visible and open, showing no signs of aggression, hoping that de-escalation might still be possible. Jessica laughed, a sound like ice cracking. "Oh, but trouble wants you, Emma. You see, we've been watching you, and we've noticed something interesting. You never fight back. You never stand up for yourself. You just take whatever we give you like a good little victim." She reached into her gym bag and pulled out a plastic water bottle, but instead of water, it was filled with a murky liquid that made Emma's stomach turn. "Do you know what this is?" Jessica asked, holding the bottle up to the light. "This is water from the toilet in the last stall, that disgusting one that never gets cleaned properly. And you're going to drink every last drop of it." Emma's mind went blank with horror. She had endured months of verbal abuse, physical intimidation, and psychological torture, but this was crossing a line that led into territory she had never imagined. The smell from the bottle was nauseating, and she could see particles floating in the brownish liquid that defied identification. "You're sick," Emma whispered, backing against the cold porcelain sinks. "You can't make me do this." "Oh, but we can," Ashley said, stepping closer, "and we will. Because nobody else is here to stop us, and nobody will believe you if you try to tell anyone what happened." Chloe produced a phone from her pocket, holding it up to record. "This is going to be so good for social media. Little Emma Chen, the toilet water girl. It has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" Emma felt something break inside her chest, a barrier that had been holding back months of rage and frustration. She thought about her father, about the lessons he had taught her, about the responsibility that came with her abilities. He had always said that violence was a last resort, but he had also taught her that some situations left no other choice. When faced with genuine evil, when all other options had been exhausted, sometimes the only appropriate response was overwhelming force. "Last chance, Emma," Jessica said, unscrewing the cap of the bottle. "Drink it voluntarily, or we'll force it down your throat. Either way, you're going to swallow every drop." Emma looked at the three faces surrounding her, searching for any sign of mercy or humanity. She found none. These were not misguided teenagers acting out of peer pressure or temporary anger. These were predators who had chosen to inflict maximum humiliation and degradation on another human being for their own entertainment. They had planned this, prepared for it, and were now savoring the moment of their victim's complete helplessness. But Emma Chen was not helpless. She never had been. "No," she said quietly, her voice carrying a new quality that made all three girls pause. "I won't drink it." Jessica's eyes flashed with fury. "Wrong answer." She lunged forward, grabbing Emma's hair with one hand while bringing the bottle toward her face with the other. "Hold her arms." That was the moment when months of careful self-control finally shattered. Emma's body moved before her conscious mind could stop it. Muscle memory taking over as 17 years of training erupted from the depths where she had tried to bury it. Her left hand shot up, fingers extended, striking Jessica's wrist with surgical precision at the pressure point that would temporarily paralyze her grip. The bottle flew from Jessica's suddenly useless fingers, shattering against the far wall and spraying its contents across the tiles. Jessica screamed, more from shock than pain, as Emma's right hand came up in a palm strike that connected with her solar plexus. The blow was perfectly calculated, hard enough to knock the wind out of her lungs, but not hard enough to cause permanent damage. Jessica doubled over, gasping for breath, as Emma spun to face the other two girls who were staring in stunned disbelief. "What the hell?" Ashley shouted, charging forward with her fists raised. She had the size and strength advantage, but Emma had something far more valuable: technique. As Ashley's wild haymaker swing came toward her head, Emma ducked low and swept her legs, sending the bigger girl crashing to the floor. Before Ashley could recover, Emma had rolled her onto her stomach and applied a rear naked choke, cutting off the blood flow to her brain, just long enough to render her unconscious. Chloe was backing toward the door, her phone forgotten as she fumbled for the handle. "You're crazy!" she screamed. "You're completely insane!" Emma rose to her feet, her movements fluid and controlled despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "I'm not crazy," she said, her voice calm and steady. "I'm just done being your victim." Jessica had managed to catch her breath and was staring at Emma with a mixture of fear and rage. "You think you're tough now? You think this changes anything?" She pulled out her own phone, presumably to call for help or to record evidence of Emma's attack. Emma moved faster than Jessica's eyes could follow, her hand darting out to snatch the phone and crush it between her fingers like it was made of paper. The plastic and metal crumbled, the screen shattering into a dozen pieces that fell to the floor like digital snow. "It changes everything," Emma said, dropping the destroyed phone at Jessica's feet. "And if you ever come near me again, if you ever threaten me again, if you ever so much as look at me the wrong way again, I will show you what I'm really capable of." The transformation was complete. The shy, quiet girl who had walked into the bathroom no longer existed. In her place stood someone who had been forged in the fires of grief, tempered by months of abuse, and finally unleashed by an act of unforgivable cruelty. Emma Chen was no longer hiding from the world. The world was about to discover what happened when you pushed the wrong person too far. The silence in the bathroom stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Jessica Martinez remained doubled over, one hand pressed against her chest where Emma's strike had landed, the other gripping the edge of a sink for support. Her face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, and for the first time in her high school career, genuine fear flickered in her green eyes. Ashley lay motionless on the cold tiles, breathing steadily but unconscious, while Chloe pressed herself against the locked door as if she could somehow melt through it and escape. Emma stood in the center of the chaos she had created, her chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. The transformation that had begun moments earlier was still rippling through her body like electricity. Every muscle felt alive, every nerve ending sharp and focused. This was how her father had taught her to feel in combat situations: present, aware, and completely in control. The months of suppressing her true nature had built up like pressure in a steam engine, and now that the valve had been released, there was no going back. "You broke my phone," Jessica wheezed, still struggling to catch her breath. Her voice had lost all of its earlier confidence, replaced by something that sounded almost like bewilderment. "You actually broke my phone." Emma looked down at the crushed remains of the device scattered across the floor. The destruction had been effortless, requiring no more thought or energy than crumpling a piece of paper. She had forgotten how easy it was to break things when you knew exactly where and how to apply pressure. Her father had taught her that lesson using wooden boards at first, then concrete blocks, and eventually metal objects that most people would consider indestructible. "That was a $400 phone," Chloe whispered from her position by the door. Her earlier bravado had evaporated completely, leaving behind a trembling girl who suddenly understood that she had severely miscalculated the dynamics of this confrontation. "Send me a bill," Emma replied, her voice carrying a new edge that none of them had ever heard before. She took a step toward Jessica, who immediately flinched backward. "But I suggest you consider it a small price to pay for the lesson you just learned." Jessica tried to straighten up, attempting to reclaim some of her lost authority. "You can't just attack people like that. This is assault. I could have you arrested, expelled, charged with a felony." But even as she spoke the words, they sounded hollow and desperate rather than threatening. Emma tilted her head slightly, studying Jessica's face with the kind of clinical detachment her father had taught her to use when assessing an opponent's psychological state. Fear was written in every line of Jessica's expression, from the way her eyes kept darting toward the exit to the slight tremor in her hands. The swim team captain was discovering what it felt like to be completely outmatched, and the experience was clearly foreign to her. "You could try," Emma said calmly. "But that would require you to explain to the police why 3 swimmers cornered one girl in an empty bathroom and tried to force her to drink toilet water. It would mean admitting that you've been systematically harassing me for months. It would mean having your parents find out what kind of person you really are when you think nobody is watching." The color drained from Jessica's face as the implications sank in. Her father was a prominent businessman in Bakersfield, someone who had built his reputation on community involvement and charitable work. The scandal of his daughter being involved in such a vicious bullying incident would destroy more than just Jessica's social standing. It would ripple through her entire family's carefully constructed public image. "You wouldn't," Jessica said, but there was no conviction in her voice. Emma smiled, and for the first time in months, it was a genuine expression of satisfaction. Rather than forced politeness, "Try me," she said simply. Ashley began to stir on the floor, groaning softly as consciousness returned. Emma immediately shifted her attention to the larger girl, ready to respond if she showed any signs of continued aggression. But Ashley's first action upon waking was to scramble backward until she hit the wall, her eyes wide with terror as she took in the scene around her. "What happened?" Ashley mumbled, touching the back of her head where it had struck the floor. "How did I end up down here?" "You tried to hit me," Emma explained matter-of-factly. "It didn't work out the way you planned." Ashley looked from Emma to her 2 friends, clearly trying to piece together the events that had led to her current position. When her gaze fell on the scattered remains of Jessica's phone, understanding began to dawn on her face. "You did this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I defended myself," Emma corrected. There's a difference. The distinction was important to her. Everything her father had taught her about combat had been grounded in the principle of appropriate response. She had used exactly enough force to neutralize the immediate threat, without causing permanent harm. Jessica would be sore for a few days, but uninjured. Ashley had been rendered unconscious for less than 2 minutes with no lasting effects. Even the destroyed phone represented restraint rather than escalation, since Emma could have easily broken Jessica's hand instead of the device. Chloe finally found her voice, though it came out as a frightened squeak. "We should go," she said, looking desperately at her 2 friends. "We should just go right now and pretend this never happened. That's the smartest thing anyone has said in this room today," Emma agreed. She moved aside, clearing a path to the door while keeping herself positioned so she could react if any of them decided to make one final aggressive move. Jessica was clearly struggling with the idea of retreat. Her entire identity was built around being the one who intimidated others, the one who controlled situations through force of personality and social pressure. Walking away from this confrontation would represent a fundamental shift in her self-image, and Emma could see the internal battle playing out across her features. "This isn't over," Jessica finally said, though the words lacked any real menace. They sounded more like a desperate attempt to salvage some dignity from a situation that had spiraled completely beyond her control. Emma considered the threat for a moment, then shook her head. "Yes, it is," she said with quiet certainty. "Because now you know what I'm capable of, and you're never going to want to find out what else I can do." The truth of that statement hung in the air like a physical presence. Emma could see it in their faces, the sudden understanding that they had been tormenting someone who could have ended their harassment at any time but had chosen not to. The realization that their victim had been showing them mercy rather than weakness. The terrifying knowledge that they had pushed someone far beyond their ability to handle the consequences. Ashley struggled to her feet, using the wall for support. Her legs were still unsteady, and she had to pause twice to maintain her balance. When she finally managed to stand upright, she looked at Emma with something approaching awe. "How did you learn to do that?" she asked. For a moment, Emma considered telling them about her father, about the years of training, about the legacy of discipline and honor that had shaped every aspect of her combat education. But these girls had forfeited any right to understand her story when they decided to try to humiliate and degrade her. Some truths were earned through respect and trust, not extracted through fear and curiosity. "That's not your concern anymore," Emma said instead. "Your only concern should be making sure our paths never cross in a hostile way again." Chloe was already pulling the door handle, desperate to escape the confined space that had become a prison of their own making. The metal clicked as the lock disengaged, and she immediately pushed the door open just wide enough to peer into the hallway beyond. "It's clear," she whispered urgently to her friends. Jessica made one final attempt to regain some semblance of control. "People will hear about this," she said, though her voice carried more uncertainty than conviction. "Everyone will know what you did." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "You're probably right," she agreed. "And when they do, they'll also know what you tried to do. They'll know that 3 athletes cornered one girl and tried to force her to drink toilet water. They'll know that you planned it, recorded it, and would have posted it online for everyone to see. They'll know exactly what kind of people you really are." The psychological weight of Emma's words was devastating. Jessica's popularity was built on carefully maintained appearances and strategic alliances. If the truth about this incident became public knowledge, it wouldn't just damage her reputation. It would completely destroy the social foundation she had spent years constructing. Her friends would abandon her, her teachers would view her differently, and her parents would be forced to confront the reality of their daughter's character. "You're bluffing," Jessica said, but the words came out more like a question than a statement. Emma reached into her messenger bag and pulled out her own phone, holding it up so all 3 girls could see the screen. "I've been recording audio since you cornered me," she said calmly. "Every word you've said, every threat you've made, every detail of your plan is documented. So no, I'm not bluffing." The revelation hit them like a physical blow. Chloe actually staggered backward, bumping into the partially open door. Ashley's face went completely white, and Jessica looked like she might be sick. None of them had considered the possibility that their victim might be documenting their actions, and the implications were staggering. "Delete it," Jessica demanded. Though her voice cracked on the words, "Delete it right now." Emma slipped the phone back into her bag and zipped it closed. "I don't think so," she said. "Consider it insurance. As long as you leave me alone, nobody else ever has to hear what happened in this room. But if you decide to continue your campaign of harassment, if you try to retaliate against me in any way, if you so much as spread rumors about me, then everyone in this school will know exactly what kind of monsters you are." The word monsters struck them like a slap. It was accurate, Emma realized, perhaps more accurate than she had initially intended. What they had planned to do to her went far beyond typical bullying or adolescent cruelty. It was the kind of calculated psychological torture that would have haunted her for years, The kind of humiliation that destroyed people's ability to trust or form healthy relationships. They had wanted to break her spirit completely, to reduce her to something less than human for their own entertainment. "We weren't going to really hurt you," Chloe said weakly, as if she could somehow retroactively minimize the severity of their actions. Emma's laugh was sharp and bitter. "You were going to force me to drink toilet water while recording it for social media. You were going to destroy my reputation, my self-respect, and my sense of safety in this school. But you're right, you weren't going to really hurt me. You were going to do something much worse. You were going to try to destroy who I am as a person." The accuracy of her assessment was written across all three of their faces. They had indeed intended to do far more damage than any physical beating could accomplish. Psychological scars lasted longer than broken bones, and humiliation could follow someone for years or even decades. They had chosen the cruelest possible form of attack, and now they were being forced to confront the true nature of their intentions. Ashley was crying now, though whether from fear, shame, or delayed shock from being choked unconscious was unclear. "We're sorry," she whispered. "We're really, really sorry." Emma studied her face, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus simple fear of consequences. Ashley's tears appeared real, and there was something in her expression that suggested actual comprehension of the harm they had intended to cause. It was a start, though Emma was far from ready to accept apologies from any of them. "Sorry isn't enough," Emma said firmly. "Sorry doesn't undo months of harassment. Sorry doesn't erase the fact that you planned to humiliate me in the most degrading way possible. Sorry is just a word you're using because you got caught and faced consequences for your actions." Jessica was looking increasingly desperate as the full scope of her situation became clear. Her carefully constructed world was crumbling around her, and she could see no way to rebuild it. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "What do we have to do to make this go away?" Emma considered the question carefully. Part of her wanted to see them suffer, to experience the same fear and humiliation they had inflicted on her for months. But that desire for revenge was exactly the kind of thinking her father had warned her against. Strength was not about dominating others, it was about protecting yourself and those who couldn't protect themselves. Using her abilities to inflict unnecessary harm would dishonor everything he had taught her. "You're going to leave me alone," Emma said finally. "Completely alone. No more comments, no more looks, no more whispered conversations when I walk by. You're going to pretend I don't exist unless I speak to you directly, and even then you're going to be respectful and polite. You're also going to stop targeting other students who can't defend themselves." The last part seemed to surprise them. They had expected her demands to focus exclusively on her own protection, not the welfare of other potential victims. But Emma had noticed the way they operated, the pattern of selecting vulnerable targets who were unlikely to fight back or report their actions. She had seen other students suffer under their attention and her father's lessons about protecting the innocent applied to more than just her own situation. "How do we know you won't use that recording anyway?" Chloe asked hesitantly. Emma met her gaze steadily. "Because unlike you, I don't enjoy causing unnecessary suffering. But make no mistake about what will happen if you break our agreement. I won't just release the audio to the school administration. I'll make sure every student, every parent, and every local news outlet knows exactly what happened here today. Your names will be permanently associated with this incident, and that association will follow you long after you graduate from this school." The threat was comprehensive and devastating. In the age of social media and permanent digital records, reputation damage could last for years or even decades. Future employers, college admissions officers, and potential romantic partners would all have access to the story of what they had tried to do in this bathroom. It was the kind of consequence that could reshape the entire trajectory of their lives. "We understand," Jessica said quietly. Her voice had lost all traces of its former arrogance, replaced by the subdued tone of someone who had been utterly defeated. "We'll stay away from you." Emma nodded once, then stepped aside to give them complete access to the door. "Then we have an understanding," she said. "Now get out of my sight." They moved as a group toward the exit, supporting each other like survivors of a natural disaster. Ashley was still unsteady on her feet, Chloe was visibly shaking, and Jessica looked like she had aged several years in the span of a few minutes. As they reached the doorway, Jessica paused and looked back one final time. "I still don't understand," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of confusion and lingering fear. "How did a girl like you learn to fight like that?" Emma's expression remained neutral, but inside she felt a surge of pride mixed with sadness. Her father would have been proud of how she had handled the situation, using exactly the right amount of force at exactly the right moment to neutralize a threat without causing permanent harm. But he also would have been saddened that such skills had become necessary in what should have been a safe educational environment. "A girl like me?" Emma repeated, raising one eyebrow. "You mean a girl who doesn't fit into your narrow definition of what strong people look like? A girl who chooses to be quiet instead of loud, thoughtful instead of aggressive? You made the mistake of confusing silence with weakness, Jessica. That's an error in judgment that could have cost you much more than a broken phone and a bruised ego." With that, the three former bullies finally left the bathroom, the door swinging shut behind them with a decisive click. Emma was alone again. But everything had changed. The girl who had entered this room 20 minutes earlier no longer existed. In her place stood someone who had reclaimed her power, someone who would never again allow herself to be victimized by those who mistook kindness for vulnerability. Emma walked to the mirror above the sinks and looked at her reflection. Her hair was slightly mussed from the brief physical confrontation, and there was a new light in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She looked like her father, she realized. Not in physical features, but in the quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly what you were capable of and having the discipline to use that knowledge responsibly. She straightened her clothes, shouldered her messenger bag, and walked toward the door. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new questions about her sudden transformation from victim to someone nobody would dare to threaten. But tonight, she would go home to her mother and begin the process of figuring out who Emma Chen was going to be now that she was no longer hiding from the world. The hallway outside the bathroom was empty, but Emma could hear the distant sounds of after-school activities echoing through the building. Life at Riverside High School was continuing as normal, unaware that a fundamental shift in the balance of power had just occurred in a third-floor bathroom. Emma walked toward the exit with steady, confident steps, leaving behind the broken phone, the spilled toilet water, and the last remnants of the frightened girl she had been pretending to be for far too long. As she reached the main stairwell, Emma's phone buzzed with a text message. She pulled it from her bag, expecting to see a message from her mother asking about her late arrival home. Instead, the screen displayed a number she didn't recognize, and the message made her blood run cold. Impressive display in the third-floor bathroom. We need to talk. Library tomorrow, 3:15 p.m. Come alone. A friend who understands what you're capable of. Emma stared at the message, her mind racing. Someone had been watching. Someone had witnessed her confrontation with Jessica and her crew, had seen her reveal abilities that she had kept hidden for months. The implications were staggering and terrifying. Who had been close enough to observe without being noticed? How long had they been watching her? And most importantly, what did they want? She deleted the message immediately, but the words were already burned into her memory. As she descended the stairs toward the main exit, Emma realized that her problems were far from over. In fact, they might just be beginning. The bathroom confrontation had been about survival and self-defense, but this message suggested something much larger and more complex was waiting for her. The unknown sender had called themselves a friend who understands what you're capable of. That phrasing implied knowledge not just of what had happened today, but of her full range of abilities. It suggested someone who recognized martial arts training when they saw it, someone who understood the difference between lucky self-defense and years of disciplined practice. Emma pushed through the heavy glass doors of the school's main entrance and stepped into the fading afternoon sunlight. The parking lot was nearly empty now, with only a few cars belonging to teachers and custodial staff scattered across the vast expanse of asphalt. The normalcy of the scene felt surreal after everything that had just transpired. She began the long walk home through neighborhoods that seemed different now, not because they had changed, but because she had. Every shadow could hide an observer. Every passing car could contain someone watching her movements. The paranoia was probably unnecessary, she told herself, but her father's training had included lessons about operational security and the importance of assuming that enemies could be anywhere. As she walked, Emma found herself analyzing the message from multiple angles. The timing suggested that the sender had been in or near the school when the confrontation occurred. The specificity of mentioning the third-floor bathroom meant they had detailed knowledge of the incident. The choice to contact her immediately rather than waiting suggested urgency or at least strong interest in establishing contact. But perhaps most troubling was the assumption that she would comply with the request to meet. The message hadn't been phrased as an invitation or a request. It had been written like a command from someone who expected to be obeyed. That level of confidence suggested either authority or leverage that Emma didn't understand. She reached her apartment complex as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her of the martial arts demonstrations her father used to perform at community events. He had always made it look effortless, flowing from one technique to another like water finding its natural course. Emma wondered what he would have made of today's events, whether he would have been proud of her restraint or concerned about the exposure of her abilities. The apartment felt smaller than usual as she let herself in with her key. Her mother wouldn't be home from her nursing shift for another 3 hours, which meant Emma had time to think through her options without having to explain why she looked like she had been in a fight. She set her messenger bag on the kitchen table and pulled out her phone again, staring at the blank screen where the mysterious message had appeared. She could ignore the meeting request, of course. She could pretend she had never received the message and hope that whoever had sent it would lose interest and move on to other concerns. But that approach carried its own risks. If someone knew about her abilities and was determined to make contact, they would likely find other ways to approach her. Better to control the circumstances of their first meeting than to be caught off guard later. Emma made herself a sandwich and sat at the small dining table where she and her mother shared their evening meals. The familiar routine of eating dinner helped ground her in the present moment, providing an anchor of normalcy in a day that had gone completely off script. She tried to focus on practical concerns like homework and chores, but her mind kept returning to the message and its implications. The sender had specifically mentioned understanding what she was capable of. That phrasing suggested someone with knowledge of martial arts, possibly someone with training of their own. It could be a teacher with a military background, a local law enforcement officer, or even another student with similar skills. The possibilities were numerous and mostly unwelcome. As the evening progressed, Emma found herself unable to concentrate on her usual activities. Her homework sat unfinished on the table while she paced the small apartment, running through scenarios and contingency plans. She had spent months hiding her abilities, and in one afternoon of self-defense, that careful concealment had been shattered. Now she was dealing with consequences she hadn't anticipated and couldn't fully control. When her mother finally arrived home, exhausted from a 12-hour shift at the hospital, Emma had to work hard to appear normal. Sarah Chen was perceptive despite her fatigue, and she immediately noticed that something was different about her daughter's demeanor. "How was school today?" Sarah asked as she kicked off her nursing shoes and collapsed onto the living room. "Couch." "Fine," Emma replied, the lie feeling heavy on her tongue. "Same as always." But even as she spoke the words, Emma knew that nothing would ever be the same as always again. The quiet, invisible girl who had started the day was gone, replaced by someone who would have to navigate an entirely new set of challenges and dangers. Tomorrow would bring the mysterious meeting in the library, and with it, answers to questions she wasn't sure she wanted to ask. As she helped her mother prepare a late dinner, Emma made a decision. She would attend the meeting, but on her own terms. She would arrive early to scout the location, position herself strategically, and be prepared for any possibility. If her father's training had taught her anything, it was that preparation and situational awareness were the keys to survival in uncertain circumstances. The unknown sender might think they held all the cards, but Emma Chen was no longer the helpless victim they might be expecting to meet. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same combination of strength and discipline that had served her so well in the bathroom confrontation. The game had changed, but she was still playing to win. The next morning arrived with an overcast sky that matched Emma's mood perfectly. She had barely slept, her mind cycling through endless possibilities about who might have witnessed yesterday's confrontation and what they might want from her. Every time she had started to drift off, her father's voice would echo in her memory, reminding her that awareness was the difference between life and death in dangerous situations. The mysterious message had transformed what should have been a victory into the opening move of a much larger and more complex game. Emma dressed carefully, choosing clothes that would allow for quick movement while still appearing normal to casual observers. Her dark jeans and fitted hoodie looked typical for a high school student, but the fabric wouldn't restrict her range of motion if she needed to defend herself. She slipped a small tactical knife into her boot, a gift from her father that she had never thought she would need to carry in school. The weight of it against her ankle was both comforting and ominous. The walk to Riverside High felt different now. Emma found herself automatically scanning for threats, noting escape routes, and identifying potential weapons in her environment. A broken tree branch could become a staff, a handful of gravel could blind an attacker, and the metal fence posts along the sidewalk could provide cover if needed. Her father's training was reasserting itself after months of dormancy, transforming her perception of the ordinary suburban landscape into a tactical assessment. When she arrived at school, the first thing Emma noticed was the change in how other students looked at her. Word had clearly spread about something happening yesterday, though the details seemed to be getting distorted as they passed from person to person. She caught fragments of whispered conversations as she moved through the hallways, stories that bore little resemblance to what had actually occurred in the third-floor bathroom. Some versions had her beating up 3 seniors single-handedly. Others claimed she had been caught dealing drugs and had fought the police. The most ridiculous variation suggested that she was actually an undercover government agent investigating teenage crime rings. Emma realized that the truth was often less believable than fiction, and people would naturally gravitate toward explanations that fit their existing assumptions about the world. Jessica Martinez was notably absent from her usual position holding court near the main entrance. Emma spotted her later in the morning, standing alone by her locker with her head down and her shoulders hunched. The confident queen bee who had ruled the school's social hierarchy had been replaced by someone who looked small and afraid. When their eyes met across the crowded hallway, Jessica immediately looked away and hurried in the opposite direction. Chloe and Ashley were equally subdued, sticking close together, but avoiding their usual aggressive behavior toward other students. Emma watched them interact with some of the younger kids they had previously targeted, noting that they now treated these potential victims with careful politeness rather than casual cruelty. The change was dramatic and immediate, suggesting that yesterday's lesson had been thoroughly absorbed. During lunch period, Emma chose a table in the corner of the cafeteria where she could observe the entire room while keeping her back to the wall. The positioning was automatic, another gift from her father's tactical instruction that had become second nature. She ate mechanically while watching the social dynamics play out around her, noting how the absence of Jessica's group from their usual power games had created a noticeable shift in the cafeteria's atmosphere. Students who had previously been targets were sitting up straighter, speaking more loudly, and generally behaving with less fear. The ripple effects of removing 3 predators from the ecosystem were already becoming visible, and Emma felt a surge of satisfaction that her actions had helped more people than just herself. Her father had always taught her that strength was meant to be used in service of others, not just for personal protection. As the school day progressed, Emma became increasingly aware that someone was watching her. It wasn't the casual curiosity of students trying to figure out what had really happened yesterday. This was the focused attention of someone with professional interest in her activities. She caught glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, shadows that seemed to follow her from class to class, and the distinct feeling that eyes were tracking her every move. The sensation was both familiar and unwelcome. Her father had taught her to trust her instincts about surveillance, explaining that humans had evolved sophisticated threat detection systems that operated below the level of conscious awareness. When every fiber of your being told you that you were being watched, it was usually because you were. The question was whether the watcher represented friend or foe. By the time her final class ended, Emma had identified at least 3 possible sources of the surveillance. There was Marcus Johnson, a senior she barely knew who seemed to appear in her vicinity with suspicious frequency. Ms. Rodriguez, the school counselor, had been asking pointed questions about Emma's adjustment to recent changes that suggested knowledge of more than just typical teenage problems. And there was a substitute teacher in the science department who claimed to be covering for a colleague, but seemed more interested in watching students than actually teaching. The mysterious 3:15 p.m. meeting time was approaching, and Emma made her decision to arrive early and scout the library before her unknown contact could establish control of the situation. She gathered her belongings slowly, allowing most of the other students to clear out before making her way toward the library. The building felt different in the late afternoon, with longer shadows and the kind of institutional quiet that only came when most of the occupants had gone home. The library at Riverside High was a modern facility with multiple levels, computer stations, and plenty of places where someone could observe without being seen. Emma entered through the main entrance but immediately moved to a secondary stairwell. That would allow her to access the upper level unseen. From the balcony overlooking the main reading area, she had a clear view of anyone who entered while remaining concealed herself. At exactly 3:10 p.m., Marcus Johnson walked through the library doors. Emma wasn't surprised to see him. He had been one of her primary suspects for the mysterious message sender. What did surprise her was how he moved through the space. His casual student act disappeared the moment he thought he was unobserved, replaced by the kind of systematic situational assessment that spoke of professional training. Marcus positioned himself at a table with clear sight lines to all entrances and exits, keeping his back to a wall and his hands free for quick movement. His body language was alert but relaxed, the stance of someone comfortable with potentially dangerous situations. Emma revised her assessment of him from curious student to something much more interesting and potentially threatening. At 3:13 p.m., Ms. Rodriguez entered the library and took a position at the reference desk, where she began sorting through papers with obvious disinterest. Her placement gave her an excellent view of the main seating area while appearing to be engaged in legitimate work. Emma noted that the counselor's supposedly casual activity allowed her to monitor the entire first floor without seeming to be doing surveillance. The substitute science teacher arrived at 3:14 p.m., browsing the shelves near the back of the library with the kind of aimless wandering that suggested he was actually establishing a perimeter around the meeting area. Emma realized that she had walked into a situation involving at least 3 people who were clearly working together and had military or law enforcement backgrounds. At 3:15 p.m. exactly, Emma made her decision to take control of the situation rather than wait to be controlled. Buy it. She moved quietly down the back stairwell and approached Marcus's table from an unexpected angle, sliding into the chair across from him before he realized she was there. The momentary surprise on his face confirmed her suspicion that he had been expecting to manage the encounter according to his own plan. "Marcus Johnson," she said quietly, keeping her voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to other parts of the library. "Senior class, transferred here from a military academy in Colorado last year. Father is stationed at Edwards Air Force Base. Mother works for a defense contractor. You've been watching me for weeks, not just since yesterday." Marcus's expression shifted from surprise to respect as he realized that Emma had done her own research and was far more observant than he had anticipated. "You're very thorough," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that suggested he had lived in multiple places during his childhood. "Most people don't notice surveillance unless they've been trained to look for it. Most people haven't been trained by a Marine Corps combat instructor," Emma replied, noting how his posture straightened at the mention of her father's background. "Most people also don't get mysterious text messages from strangers who claim to understand their capabilities." Marcus nodded toward Ms. Rodriguez and the substitute teacher, both of whom had subtly adjusted their positions to provide better coverage of the conversation area. "We needed to be sure about you before making direct contact. Yesterday's incident confirmed what we had suspected, but we needed to see how you handled the aftermath." "We?" Emma asked, though she was already beginning to understand the scope of what she had stumbled into. "How many people are involved in this little surveillance operation?" "Enough," Marcus said cryptically. "The question isn't how many of us there are. The question is whether you're ready to learn why we've been watching you and what we want to offer you." Emma leaned back in her chair, maintaining casual body language while keeping her muscles ready for quick movement. "I'm listening," she said, "but I should warn you that I don't respond well to being manipulated or coerced." Marcus smiled, and for the first time since she had met him, the expression seemed genuine rather than calculated. "We wouldn't dream of trying to manipulate someone with your skill set," he said. "What we're offering is an opportunity to use those skills for something larger than just protecting yourself from high school bullies. And what exactly would that something be?" Emma asked, though she was beginning to suspect that the answer would change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Marcus glanced around the library, confirming that they weren't being overheard, then leaned forward slightly. "Have you ever heard of the Civilian Defense Corps?" he asked quietly. Emma shook her head, though the name immediately triggered associations with her father's military background and his occasional mentions of special operations that he couldn't discuss in detail. The combination of civilian and defense suggested something outside the normal military structure, possibly involving people with specialized skills who operated in everyday environments. "It's a network of individuals with exceptional abilities who work to identify and neutralize threats that conventional law enforcement can't handle," Marcus explained. "People like you, with combat training and the discipline to use it responsibly. People who can blend into normal society while remaining ready to act when circumstances require it." The explanation raised more questions than it answered, but Emma was beginning to understand why her father had been so insistent about teaching her not just fighting techniques, but also the ethical framework that should govern their use. He had been preparing her for exactly this kind of situation, where her abilities would attract the attention of people who wanted to recruit them for purposes beyond personal protection. "What makes you think I'm interested in joining some kind of secret organization?" Emma asked, testing to see how much pressure they would apply and how they would respond to resistance. Because you chose to protect other students yesterday. Not just yourself, Miss Rodriguez said, approaching their table with a stack of papers that was obviously a prop. Your demands included stopping the harassment of other vulnerable kids, which tells us that you understand the responsibility that comes with power. Emma studied the counselor's face, noting the kind of calm confidence that came from extensive experience in dangerous situations. Ms. Rodriguez was clearly much more than a school employee, and her knowledge of yesterday's bathroom conversation suggested either sophisticated surveillance equipment or direct observation that Emma had somehow missed. You were listening, Emma said, making it a statement rather than a question. The third-floor bathroom has been under audio surveillance since the beginning of the school year, the substitute teacher said, joining their impromptu meeting with the casual confidence of someone revealing information that had already been approved for disclosure. We've been tracking bullying incidents as part of a larger study on adolescent aggression patterns. The revelation that her private confrontation had been recorded was both disturbing and somehow reassuring. It meant that there was objective evidence of what had really happened, which could protect her if Jessica or her friends decided to file false reports. But it also meant that her moment of revealing her true capabilities had been captured and analyzed by people with unknown agendas. So you have the whole thing on tape, Emma said, wondering what other conversations and incidents had been recorded without the participants' knowledge. We have documentation of 17 separate bullying incidents involving Jessica Martinez's group over the past 4 months, Ms. Rodriguez confirmed. We also have records of 12 other students who have been targeted by various groups throughout the school. What we don't have is anyone else with your combination of skills and ethical framework. Emma was beginning to understand the scope of what they were proposing. This wasn't just about her individual situation or even about the bullying problem. At Riverside High School, they were recruiting her for something much larger, something that would require her to use her father's training in ways he had probably never intended. What exactly would you want me to do? She asked, keeping her voice neutral while her mind raced through the implications of whatever answer they might give. Marcus pulled out a tablet and showed her a series of photographs that made her stomach clench with recognition. They were surveillance images of various locations around Bakersfield, but each one showed adults engaged in the same kind of predatory behavior that Jessica and her friends had been practicing on a smaller scale. Adult bullies targeting vulnerable individuals, workplace harassment escalating to dangerous levels, and what appeared to be organized intimidation campaigns against people who couldn't defend themselves. The same patterns that play out in high schools exist in the adult world, Marcus explained. But the consequences are more severe, and the victims often have fewer resources for protection. We identify situations where conventional law enforcement can't or won't intervene effectively, and we provide alternative solutions. Emma stared at the images, seeing echoes of her own experience in the faces of the adult victims. People who were being systematically degraded and humiliated by those with more power. People who had nowhere to turn for help. People who needed someone with her particular combination of skills and moral compass to level the playing field. You want me to be a vigilante, she said, testing their reaction to the blunt characterization. We want you to be a protector, Ms. Rodriguez corrected. Someone who can step in when the system fails and innocent people are being harmed. Someone who can use force responsibly and effectively to stop predators who prey on the vulnerable. The offer was both tempting and terrifying. Emma could see herself in that role, using her father's training to help people who couldn't help themselves. But she could also see how easily such work could consume her life, pulling her away from normal teenage experiences and into a world of constant danger and moral complexity. I need time to think about this, she said finally. Marcus nodded as if he had expected that response. Take all the time you need, he said. But while you're thinking, consider this. Yesterday, you saved yourself and probably several other students from months or years of continued harassment. Imagine how many people you could help if you decided to make protection your mission rather than just your last resort. Emma stood to leave, her mind spinning with questions and possibilities. As she gathered her belongings, Ms. Rodriguez placed a business card on the table. It looked like a normal counselor's card, but Emma noticed that the phone number was different from the one listed in the school directory. "When you're ready to learn more," Ms. Rodriguez said, "call that number, but don't wait too long. The people in those photographs need help, and there aren't many others with your qualifications." Emma pocketed the card and walked toward the library exit, feeling the weight of their attention following her every step. At the doorway, she turned back to see all three of them watching her with expressions that mixed hope with professional assessment. They believed they had found someone special, someone who could make a real difference in a world where predators often went unpunished and victims suffered in silence. As she left the school building and began the walk home, Emma realized that her transformation was far from complete. Yesterday's bathroom confrontation had been just the beginning, the first step in a journey that could lead her toward becoming someone entirely different from the quiet, invisible girl she had been pretending to be. The question was whether she had the courage to take the next step into a world where her father's training would be put to use as he had never explicitly prepared her for. The evening air felt cool against her skin as she walked through neighborhoods that suddenly seemed full of hidden dangers and unprotected victims. Emma found herself looking at every interaction through new eyes, wondering how many people were suffering in silence and how many situations might require the kind of intervention that only someone with her skills could provide. The civilian Defense Corps had offered her a chance to transform her personal victory into something much larger, but the decision would require her to choose between the safety of anonymity and the responsibility of using her abilities to help others who couldn't help themselves. Emma spent the next 3 days in a state of mental turbulence that made concentration nearly impossible. The business card from Ms. Rodriguez felt like it was burning a hole in her pocket, a constant reminder of the choice she needed to make. Her mother noticed the change in her behavior, commenting on how distracted and restless she seemed. But Emma couldn't explain what was troubling her, without revealing everything that had happened in the bathroom and afterward. During those 3 days, Emma found herself paying closer attention to the dynamics around her, not just at school, but everywhere she went. She noticed the way some customers treated cashiers at the grocery store, the intimidation tactics used by aggressive drivers in parking lots, and the subtle but persistent harassment that seemed to follow certain people wherever they went. Her father's training had given her the ability to recognize predatory behavior, and now that she was looking for it, she saw it everywhere. The most disturbing observation came on Thursday afternoon when she witnessed an incident at the bus stop near her apartment complex. An elderly man with a walker was trying to board the city bus when a group of teenagers began mocking his slow movements and physical limitations. Their behavior escalated quickly from verbal harassment to physically blocking his path and threatening to push him over. The bus driver did nothing, other passengers looked away, and the old man was clearly terrified. Emma watched from across the street as the situation unfolded, her hands clenched into fists as every instinct screamed at her to intervene. She could have ended the harassment in seconds, scattered the teenagers with a few well-placed pressure point strikes that would have left them gasping and confused without causing permanent injury. But she hesitated, paralyzed by uncertainty about whether she had the right to use violence against people who weren't directly threatening her. By the time she overcame her hesitation and started moving toward the bus stop, a police car had arrived and the teenagers had melted away into the crowd. The elderly man finally boarded the bus, but Emma could see the humiliation and fear in his posture. He had been victimized in broad daylight while surrounded by people who could have helped, but chose not to get involved. The incident haunted her for the rest of the evening. That night, Emma pulled out her father's journal, a leather-bound notebook, where he had recorded his thoughts about combat philosophy and the ethical use of force. She had avoided reading it since his death, afraid that it would be too painful, but now she needed his guidance more than ever. The pages were filled with his careful handwriting, observations from his years of military service and training civilian students in martial arts. One passage stood out with particular relevance to her current situation. The greatest warriors are not those who win the most fights, but those who prevent the most suffering. Strength without compassion is mere brutality, but compassion without strength is often helpless to protect the innocent. The challenge is finding the balance between action and restraint, between intervention and overreach. When good people choose to do nothing in the face of evil, they become complicit in that evil through their inaction. Emma read the passage multiple times, feeling her father's presence in every word. He had understood the burden that came with the ability to protect others, and he had tried to prepare her for the moral complexity she would face. The incident at the bus stop had shown her what happened when capable people chose not to act, and the weight of that knowledge was almost unbearable. On Friday morning, Emma made her decision. She called the number on Miss Rodriguez's business card during her lunch period, stepping outside the school building to ensure privacy for the conversation. The phone was answered on the first ring by a voice she didn't recognize, professional and crisp. "Civilian Defense Corps, how may I help you?" "This is Emma Chen," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "I was given this number by Ms. Rodriguez. I'm ready to learn more about what you do." "Excellent," the voice replied. "There's a coffee shop called The Daily Grind on Oak Street, about 6 blocks from your school. Can you be there at 4:30 p.m. today?" Emma confirmed the meeting and spent the rest of the school day in a state of nervous anticipation. She had crossed a line by making the phone call, committing herself to at least hearing what the Civilian Defense Corps had to offer. There would be no going back to the simple life of hiding her abilities and pretending to be normal. The Daily Grind turned out to be a small, independent coffee shop with exposed brick walls and mismatched furniture that created a deliberately casual atmosphere. Emma arrived 15 minutes early and chose a table in the back corner where she could observe the entrance while keeping her back protected. The positioning had become automatic, another gift from her father's tactical instruction. At exactly 4:30 p.m., a woman in her 40s entered the coffee shop and looked around until she spotted Emma. She was tall and athletic, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of confident bearing that suggested extensive military or law enforcement experience. She wore civilian clothes, but Emma immediately recognized the subtle signs of someone who was armed and ready for trouble. "Emma Chen?" the woman asked as she approached the table. "I'm Commander Sarah Mitchell, retired Navy SEAL and current Operations Coordinator for the CDC. Thank you for reaching out." Emma stood to shake hands, noting the woman's firm grip and the way her eyes automatically scanned the coffee shop for potential threats before settling into focused attention on their conversation. Commander Mitchell ordered coffee for both of them, then settled into the chair across from Emma, with the relaxed alertness of someone comfortable in potentially dangerous situations. "I've read the reports about your encounter with the Martinez group," Commander Mitchell began without preamble. "Your restraint was impressive, as was your tactical awareness. Most people with your skill level would have caused more damage or failed to maintain emotional control under that level of stress." Emma appreciated the direct approach, which reminded her of her father's communication style. "I was taught that violence should be the last resort and that when it becomes necessary, it should be precise and proportional to the threat." "Good philosophy," Commander Mitchell agreed. "It's also the foundation of everything the CDC does. We're not vigilantes or revenge seekers. We're protectors who intervene when conventional systems fail and innocent people are being harmed." Over the next hour, Commander Mitchell explained the structure and mission of the Civilian Defense Corps in detail that was both fascinating and overwhelming. The organization operated as a network of individuals with specialized skills who maintained normal lives and identities while remaining ready to respond to situations that required their particular capabilities. Members included former military personnel, law enforcement officers, martial artists, and other professionals who had chosen to use their abilities in service of protecting others. The CDC focused on three primary areas of operation. First, they provided protection for individuals who were being systematically targeted by predators that conventional law enforcement couldn't or wouldn't stop. Second, they intervened in situations where vulnerable people were being exploited or abused by those with institutional power. Third, they worked to identify and disrupt organized networks of criminals who preyed on society's most defenseless members. The work isn't glamorous, Commander Mitchell explained. Most of our interventions are subtle, designed to change behavior patterns rather than create dramatic confrontations. We might arrange for a workplace bully to face consequences for their actions, or ensure that someone threatening a vulnerable family suddenly finds themselves facing unexpected legal problems. Sometimes more direct intervention is necessary, but we always prefer solutions that don't require violence. Emma found herself drawn to the organization's emphasis on protection over punishment, and the careful consideration they gave to the ethical implications of their actions. This wasn't about seeking revenge or inflicting harm on bad people. It was about creating a safety net for those who had nowhere else to turn for help. What would be expected of me if I joined? Emma asked, aware that she was already thinking in terms of when rather than if. Initially, training and observation, Commander Mitchell replied. You have excellent foundational skills, but there's a difference between self-defense and protective operations. You would need to learn surveillance techniques, evidence gathering, legal boundaries, and de-escalation strategies. Most importantly, you would need to develop the judgment to know when intervention is appropriate and when it might cause more harm than good. The training program sounded comprehensive and challenging, covering everything from advanced martial arts techniques to psychology and law. Emma would maintain her normal life as a high school student, while gradually taking on increasing responsibilities within the organization. Her first assignments would be purely observational, learning to identify and document threats without taking action. Only after proving her judgment and reliability would she be trusted with more active roles. There's something else you should know, Commander Mitchell added, her expression becoming more serious. The people we protect often don't know we exist. We work in the shadows, and our successes are measured by things that don't happen rather than things that do. You won't get recognition or thanks for this work. In fact, if you do it properly, nobody will ever know you were involved. Emma considered this aspect of the work, realizing that it appealed to her more than any form of public recognition would have. She had spent months trying to be invisible, and the idea of using that invisibility to help others felt like a perfect application of skills she had already developed. When would the training start? She asked. Commander Mitchell smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Emma had seen from her. It already has, she said. The past few days while you were deciding whether to contact us, we've been watching how you handle the knowledge of what we do. The way you've been observing your environment, noticing patterns of behavior, thinking about intervention and restraint, that's all part of the evaluation process. Emma felt a moment of indignation at being tested without her knowledge, followed immediately by respect for the thoroughness of their approach. If the CDC was going to trust her with the responsibility of protecting others, they needed to be absolutely certain about her character and judgment. What happens next? Emma asked. Next, you go home and think about whether you're truly ready for this commitment, Commander Mitchell said. This isn't a hobby or a part-time activity. Once you're fully operational, you'll carry the weight of knowing that your decisions could mean the difference between safety and harm for people who have no other protection. It's a responsibility that will change how you see the world and your place in it. Emma knew that the transformation had already begun. The girl who had walked into the third-floor bathroom 3 days earlier would never have considered joining a secret organization dedicated to protecting strangers. But that girl had been broken apart by the confrontation with Jessica and her crew, and what had emerged from the wreckage was someone stronger and more purposeful. "I don't need more time to think," Emma said with quiet certainty. "I'm ready to start training." Commander Mitchell studied her face for a long moment, then nodded with satisfaction. "Welcome to the Civilian Defense Corps, Emma Chen. Your father would be proud." The mention of her father hit Emma with unexpected emotional force, bringing tears to her eyes for the first time since the bathroom incident. She had been so focused on practical concerns and immediate decisions that she hadn't fully processed what this choice meant in terms of honoring his memory and continuing his legacy of protection and service. "How did you know about my father?" Emma asked, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "We've been aware of Master Sergeant David Chun's training methods for years," Commander Mitchell replied gently. "He was exactly the kind of person we would have recruited if he had lived long enough for us to approach him. In many ways, you're carrying on work that he was already doing, just in a different context." Emma felt a sense of completion that she hadn't experienced since her father's death, as if pieces of her life were finally falling into place in a pattern that made sense. The skills he had taught her, the values he had instilled, and the responsibility he had emphasized were all pointing toward this moment and this choice. Over the next 2 hours, Commander Mitchell outlined Emma's initial training schedule and introduced her to the CDC's operational protocols. Emma would continue attending school normally while spending her afternoons and weekends learning advanced surveillance techniques, threat assessment, and intervention strategies. She would be paired with experienced operatives who would mentor her through increasingly complex scenarios until she was ready for independent assignments. The conversation was interrupted by Commander Mitchell's phone buzzing with an urgent message. She read it quickly, her expression becoming focused and alert in a way that made Emma's pulse quicken with anticipation. "There's a situation developing that might be perfect for your first observational exercise," Commander Mitchell said. "A group of college students has been systematically harassing a professor who gave them failing grades. It started with online harassment, but escalated yesterday to following her home and vandalizing her car. Campus security can't do much because the harassment is happening off university property, and local police say they need more evidence before they can take action." Emma felt her training instincts activate as Commander Mitchell described the situation. The parallels to her own experience were obvious, but the adult context and off-campus location created complications that would require careful planning and coordination. "What would you want me to do?" Emma asked. "Observe and document, Commander," Mitchell replied. "We need to understand their patterns, identify the leadership structure, and gather evidence that could be used for legal action if necessary. Your job would be to get close enough to record their activities without being detected or putting yourself at risk." The assignment sounded both challenging and meaningful, a chance to use her developing skills to help someone who was facing the same kind of systematic intimidation that Emma had endured. The professor was in the same position Emma had been in just days earlier, dealing with predators who were confident that their victim couldn't fight back effectively. "When do we start?" Emma asked, surprised by her own eagerness to take action. "Tomorrow afternoon," Commander Mitchell said. "But first, there are some people you need to meet and some equipment you need to learn how to use." As they left the coffee shop together, Emma felt the weight of her new responsibility settling onto her shoulders like her father's old military jacket. It was heavy but comfortable, a burden she was ready to carry in service of something larger than herself. The quiet, invisible girl who had started the week was gone completely now, replaced by someone who would use her invisibility as a weapon against those who preyed on the defenseless. Walking back toward her apartment, Emma realized that her transformation was finally complete. She was no longer hiding from the world or trying to blend in with normal teenagers who had never faced real danger or moral complexity. She was Emma Chen, daughter of a warrior, student of protection, and newest member of an organization dedicated to standing between predators and their victims. The bathroom confrontation with Jessica Martinez had been the spark that ignited this change, but the real fire had been building inside her since her father's death. Now that fire had found its purpose, and Emma was ready to use it to light the way for others who were trapped in darkness and fear. The bullies who had tried to break her spirit had instead unleashed something far more dangerous than they could have imagined, a protector who would never again allow the innocent to suffer while she had the power to intervene. As the sun set over Bakersfield, casting long shadows across the suburban landscape, Emma Chen walked home with the confidence of someone who had finally found her true calling. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to make a difference in the lives of people who needed protection. She was ready for whatever came next, armed with her father's training, her own hard-won wisdom, and the support of an organization that understood the true meaning of strength. The girl who had been cornered in a bathroom and forced to drink toilet water was gone forever. In her place stood someone who would ensure that no one else would have to face such humiliation alone. Emma Chen had become exactly what the world needed: a guardian in the shadows, ready to step into the light whenever justice required it. 3 months later, Emma Chen stood in the shadows of the Bakersfield Community College parking garage, her breathing controlled and her senses hyper-tuned to every sound and movement around her. The small recording device in her jacket pocket was capturing everything as she watched a group of 5 college students corner Professor Linda Walsh near her car. This wasn't her first CDC assignment, but it was the most complex situation she had handled independently, and the stakes felt higher than anything she had faced before. Professor Walsh was a slight woman in her 50s who taught environmental science and had made the mistake of failing 3 prominent students whose parents were major donors to the college. What had started as angry emails and negative course evaluations had escalated over the past month into systematic harassment that now included following her to and from work, vandalizing her property, and making increasingly explicit threats about what would happen if she didn't change their grades. The college administration had proven useless, more concerned about protecting their donors than their faculty. Campus security claimed their jurisdiction ended at the parking garage entrance. Local police said they couldn't take action without evidence of actual physical assault. Professor Walsh was trapped in exactly the kind of systematic victimization that the CDC existed to address, and Emma had spent 2 weeks gathering the evidence needed to end it permanently. The leader of the harassment group was Derek Morrison, a 20-year-old whose father owned the largest construction company in the county. Derek had the kind of entitled arrogance that came from never facing real consequences for his actions, and he clearly viewed Professor Walsh as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed through intimidation. His 4 companions were typical followers, eager to participate in cruelty but lacking the intelligence or initiative to plan it themselves. Emma watched through her night vision scope as Derek approached Professor Walsh's car, his companions spreading out to block her escape routes. The professor's fear was visible even from Emma's concealed position 30 yards away, and she could see the woman's hands shaking as she fumbled with her car keys. "Still think you're too good to give us the grades we deserve?" Derek's voice carried clearly across the concrete structure, echoing off the walls in a way that made his words sound even more menacing. "My dad contributes more money to this pathetic school in 1 year than you make in 5. You're nothing but a glorified high school teacher who got lucky." Professor Walsh tried to maintain her composure, but Emma could hear the tremor in her voice as she responded. "Your grades reflect your performance in my class, Derek. If you want better grades, you need to do better work." Derek laughed, a sound that held no humor whatsoever. "Wrong answer, Professor. See, here's the thing about people like you. You think your little pieces of paper and your fancy degrees make you important. But in the real world, money talks and everything else walks. And right now, my money is telling your career to take a long walk off a short pier." Emma's finger moved to transmitter in her pocket, ready to signal Commander Mitchell and the backup team positioned around the parking garage. The plan was to gather enough evidence for criminal charges while ensuring Professor Walsh's safety, but Emma was prepared to intervene directly if the situation escalated beyond verbal threats. One of Derek's companions, a heavy-set student named Brad Kellerman, pulled out his phone and began recording. "This is going to be so good for social media," he said with obvious anticipation. "Professor Walsh's greatest hits. Maybe we'll get enough footage to make a whole series." The mention of recording triggered memories of Emma's own bathroom confrontation, and she felt her jaw clench with controlled anger. These predators were using the same playbook that Jessica Martinez had tried to use against her: systematic humiliation designed to destroy their victim's sense of safety and self-worth. The only difference was the age and setting of the participants. "You can't keep doing this," Professor Walsh said, her voice gaining strength as desperation overcame fear. "This is harassment, and it's illegal. I have rights, and I won't be intimidated into compromising my professional standards." Derek's expression darkened at the show of defiance. "Rights?" he repeated mockingly. "You want to talk about rights? Let me tell you about your rights, Professor. You have the right to change our grades to A's. You have the right to apologize for being such a stubborn bitch. And you have the right to remember that we know where you live, where you shop, and where you eat lunch every day." The explicit threat triggered Emma's predetermined action threshold. She activated her transmitter twice, the signal for immediate backup, then began moving through the parking garage's support columns toward the confrontation. Her approach was silent and systematic, using every piece of cover to remain undetected, while closing the distance to striking range. "In fact," Derek continued, clearly enjoying the fear in Professor Walsh's eyes, "maybe it's time we paid a visit to your house. I bet your neighbors would be very interested to hear about how you're discriminating against students whose families support this institution." Professor Walsh backed against her car, trapped between the vehicle and the 5 young men who had positioned themselves to prevent any escape. Emma could see that the woman was on the verge of panic, her breathing rapid and her movements becoming increasingly erratic as fight or flight responses warred with professional training that had never prepared her for this kind of situation. Emma reached the optimal position just as Derek stepped closer to Professor Walsh, his intention clearly shifting from verbal intimidation to physical contact. She had a clear view of all 5 harassers and multiple escape routes if the situation went badly. Most importantly, she was close enough to intervene before any of them could harm Professor Walsh if they decided to escalate beyond threats. "Here's what's going to happen," Derek said, reaching toward the professor's purse. "You're going to give us your phone, and we're going to delete any recordings or photos you might have taken of us. Then you're going to go home and think very carefully about whether you want to keep making problems for people who can make much bigger problems for you." Emma's training took over as Derek's hand made contact with Professor Walsh's purse. This was no longer just harassment. It was robbery and assault, crimes that justified immediate intervention. She stepped out from behind the concrete column, her movement fluid and purposeful as she entered the circle of light around Professor Walsh's car. "That's far enough," Emma said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that her father had taught her to project in combat situations. "Step away from her and keep your hands where I can see them." The 5 college students spun toward her voice, their faces showing confusion and surprise at the appearance of what looked like a teenage girl in their adult criminal enterprise. Derek recovered first, his expression shifting from surprise to amusement as he took in Emma's slight frame and apparent youth. "Well, well," Derek said with a condescending smile. "Looks like the professor called in the cavalry. What are you, her teaching assistant, her babysitter? Or just some high school kid who got lost looking for the exit?" Emma positioned herself between the harassers and Professor Walsh, her stance relaxed but ready for immediate action. "I'm someone who doesn't like watching 5 grown men terrorize a woman half their size," she replied calmly. "Consider this your one opportunity to walk away before this situation gets much worse for all of you." Brad laughed, still holding his phone up to record the encounter. "Did you hear that, guys? The little girl is threatening us. This just keeps getting better and better. Wait until everyone sees the video of Derek dealing with some wannabe hero." Derek cracked his knuckles in what was clearly meant to be an intimidating display. "You picked the wrong fight, little girl. Why don't you run along home before you get hurt? Adults are having a conversation here." Emma's response was to shift her weight slightly, a movement so subtle that none of the college students recognized it as preparation for combat. But Professor Walsh, who had been watching the exchange with growing hope, saw something in Emma's posture that suggested this teenage girl was far more dangerous than she appeared. "Last warning," Emma said, her voice remaining perfectly calm despite the adrenaline beginning to flow through her system. "Walk away now, and this ends with everyone going home safely. Make the wrong choice, and you'll spend the rest of the night explaining to police officers why 5 college students thought it was appropriate to assault and rob a professor in a parking garage." Derek's patience with negotiation had clearly reached its limit. "You know what? I'm tired of listening to threats from some high school brat who thinks she's tough." He stepped toward Emma with obvious aggressive intent. "Time for your first lesson in how the real world works." Emma waited until Derek was within striking distance, then moved with the kind of explosive speed that her months of CDC training had refined to perfection. Her first strike was a palm thrust to his solar plexus that doubled him over and left him gasping for breath. Before any of his companions could react, she had pivoted and delivered a precise kick to Brad's wrist that sent his phone flying across the parking garage to shatter against a concrete wall. The remaining 3 students hesitated, clearly shocked by the sudden reversal of what they had expected to be an easy confrontation. Emma used their momentary confusion to position herself with optimal angles of attack while keeping Professor Walsh behind her and out of the potential combat zone. "Anyone else want to learn about the real world?" Emma asked, her breathing still completely controlled, despite having just neutralized 2 threats in less than 3 seconds. One of the remaining students, a thin young man named Craig, tried to circle around behind Emma while his friends distracted her from the front. The maneuver might have worked against an untrained opponent, but Emma's peripheral vision and spatial awareness had been honed through months of combat scenarios. She sensed his movement and spun to intercept him with a leg sweep that sent him crashing into a parked car. Derek was beginning to recover his breath, though he remained hunched over and unable to stand upright. "You're dead," he wheezed, his voice barely audible. "My father will destroy you for this. He'll have you arrested, expelled, charged with assault. You have no idea who you're messing with." Emma's smile was cold and predatory in a way that would have been familiar to Jessica Martinez if she had been present to witness it. "Actually, Derek, I know exactly who I'm messing with. I know your father's construction company has been using undocumented workers and paying them below minimum wage. I know about the building code violations that have been covered up through strategic campaign contributions. I know about the environmental infractions that somehow never get reported to state authorities." Derek's face went pale as the implications of Emma's knowledge sank in. The CDC's research capabilities were far more extensive than most people realized, and they had spent weeks gathering information on everyone involved in Professor Walsh's harassment. Derek Morrison and his friends had unknowingly picked a fight with an organization that specialized in destroying people who abused their power to harm others. "You're bluffing," Derek said, but his voice lacked conviction. Emma pulled out her phone and showed him the screen, which displayed the first page of a comprehensive dossier on Morrison Construction's illegal activities. The State Labor Board, the Building Inspector's Office, and the Environmental Protection Agency will all receive copies of this documentation if you or any of your friends ever come near Professor Walsh again. Your father's business will be shut down within a week, and the family fortune will disappear into legal fees and government fines. The psychological impact of the threat was devastating. Derek Morrison had built his entire identity around his father's wealth and influence, and the prospect of losing that protection left him completely defenseless. His companions, who had been attracted to his leadership because of the immunity his family connections provided, suddenly found themselves looking at someone who could destroy their comfortable lives with a single phone call. "What do you want?" Derek asked, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. "I want you to transfer to a different school," Emma said matter-of-factly. "All of you. By the end of this week. I want written apologies to Professor Walsh, acknowledging your harassment and promising never to contact her again. And I want you to understand that if any of you ever engage in this kind of behavior toward anyone else, we'll be watching and ready to respond." Professor Walsh stepped forward, her fear replaced by amazement as she watched a teenage girl systematically dismantle the group that had been terrorizing her for weeks. "Who are you?" she asked quietly. Emma considered how to answer, aware that the professor deserved some explanation, but unable to reveal the full truth about the CDC's operations. "I'm someone who doesn't believe that bullies should get away with their crimes just because they have money or connections," she said finally. "Consider this a reminder that there are consequences for people who think they can terrorize others without facing any repercussions." Commander Mitchell's voice came through Emma's earpiece, barely audible to anyone not wearing the receiver. "Local police are 2 minutes out. Time to wrap this up and extract." Emma nodded almost imperceptibly, then turned her attention back to Derek and his remaining conscious companions. "You have 48 hours to submit your transfer applications and send your apologies to Professor Walsh. After that, the documentation about your family's various illegal activities gets released to every relevant authority. Are we clear?" Derek nodded weakly, still struggling to process how completely his world had been turned upside down in the space of a few minutes. His friends were equally stunned, staring at Emma with the kind of fearful respect usually reserved for natural disasters or apex predators. "Good," Emma said. "Now help your friends and get out of here before the police arrive to investigate reports of a disturbance in this parking garage." As the 5 college students limped away from the confrontation, supporting their injured companions and whispering urgently among themselves, Emma turned to Professor Walsh with an expression of gentle concern that was completely different from the cold professionalism she had shown during the fight. "Are you hurt?" Emma asked, her voice soft and reassuring. "Did they touch you or damage anything besides your sense of safety?" Professor Walsh shook her head, tears beginning to flow as the stress and fear of the past month finally found release. "I'm okay," she said, though her voice was shaking. "I just can't believe it's over. I can't believe someone actually helped me." Emma placed a comforting hand on the professor's shoulder, remembering how isolated and hopeless she had felt during her own harassment ordeal. "It's over," she said, with quiet certainty. "They won't bother you again, and if they try to retaliate in any way, they know the consequences will be swift and severe." The sound of approaching sirens indicated that the police were nearly at the parking garage, and Emma knew she needed to disappear before they arrived. The CDC's effectiveness depended on operating in the shadows and having their operatives questioned by law enforcement, could compromise ongoing operations. "I have to go," Emma said, stepping back toward the shadows between the parked cars. "But if you ever feel unsafe again, if anyone tries to pick up where these guys left off, call this number." She handed Professor Walsh a business card identical to the one Ms. Rodriguez had given her months earlier. Professor Walsh looked at the card, then back at Emma with an expression of profound gratitude mixed with lingering confusion. "Will I see you again?" she asked. Emma smiled, and for a moment she looked like exactly what she was, a 17-year-old girl who had chosen to use her abilities to help others rather than for personal gain. "Probably not," she said honestly, "but that's okay. The important thing is that you're safe, and you know that there are people who will stand up for you when the system fails." As Emma melted back into the shadows of the parking garage, she felt the familiar satisfaction that came from successfully completing a mission that had protected an innocent person from systematic victimization. Professor Walsh would be safe. Now Derek Morrison and his friends would face appropriate consequences for their actions, and the college administration would be forced to take harassment complaints more seriously in the future. The police cars were pulling into the parking garage as Emma exited through a maintenance door that led to the street behind the building. Commander Mitchell was waiting in an unmarked van, ready to debrief the operation and plan their next intervention. Emma climbed into the passenger seat, pulling off her tactical gear and replacing it with the normal clothes of a high school student. "How did it feel?" Commander Mitchell asked as they drove away from the scene. Emma considered the question carefully, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The bathroom confrontation with Jessica Martinez seemed like it had happened to a different person, someone weak and afraid who no longer existed. The girl who had been cornered and humiliated had been transformed into someone who could protect others from suffering the same fate. "It felt right," Emma said finally. "Like this is what I was always meant to do." Commander Mitchell nodded with satisfaction. "Your father would be proud," she said, repeating the words that had first convinced Emma to join the CDC. "You've become exactly the kind of protector he trained you to be." As they drove through the quiet streets of Bakersfield, Emma reflected on how completely her life had changed since that afternoon in the third-floor bathroom. She was still the same person in many ways, still quiet and observant, still preferring shadows to spotlights. But now her quietness was a weapon she used to protect others, and her preference for invisibility allowed her to strike against predators who thought they were safe from consequences. Emma Chen had discovered her true calling in the most unlikely circumstances, transformed from victim to protector through a combination of her father's training, her own moral courage, and the support of an organization that understood the responsibility that came with power. She would never again be the helpless girl who could be cornered and humiliated by bullies, because she had become something far more dangerous, a guardian who stood between the innocent and those who would harm them. The next morning, Emma walked through the halls of Riverside High School with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. Jessica Martinez and her former crew still avoided her completely, their reign of terror permanently ended by the lesson they had learned in that bathroom months earlier. Other potential bullies seemed to sense something different about Emma now, something that warned them to find easier targets elsewhere. At lunch, Emma sat alone as usual, but her solitude was no longer born of fear or social isolation. She was alone because she was always scanning her environment, always watching for signs that someone needed protection, always ready to step in when the innocent faced threats they couldn't handle themselves. Her phone buzzed with a new assignment from the CDC, another situation where systematic harassment had been allowed to continue, because the victims lacked the power to fight back effectively. Emma smiled as she read the mission briefing, feeling the familiar surge of anticipation that came with the opportunity to make a real difference in someone's life. She had found her purpose in the most unlikely way possible, And every day brought new chances to honor her father's memory by using the skills he had taught her to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The quiet girl who had once been afraid of her own shadow was gone forever, replaced by someone who used the shadows as a weapon against those who preyed on the innocent. Emma Chen had become exactly what the world needed, a guardian angel who struck from the darkness to ensure that justice prevailed even when the system failed. 6 months after the parking garage incident, Emma Chen received a message that would change everything once again. She was sitting in her AP literature class, taking notes on symbolism and contemporary fiction, when her secure CDC phone vibrated with an urgent priority alert. The message was brief but devastating. Jessica Martinez hospitalized. Suspected overdose. Your presence requested at Mercy General immediately. Emma's pen stopped moving across her notebook as the implications sank in. Jessica Martinez, the former queen bee who had tried to force her to drink toilet water, was fighting for her life in a hospital bed. The girl who had once seemed untouchable, protected by wealth and social status, had apparently fallen so far that she was now using drugs to cope with whatever her life had become. Emma raised her hand and asked to be excused for a family emergency, then gathered her belongings and headed for the parking lot where Commander Mitchell was waiting in an unmarked sedan. The drive to Mercy General Hospital was conducted in heavy silence, both women lost in their own thoughts about what this development might mean for Emma's ongoing mission. "What do we know?" Emma asked as they pulled into the hospital parking garage. Commander Mitchell's expression was grim as she consulted her tablet. Jessica was found unconscious in her bedroom by her mother this morning. Empty pill bottles, alcohol, and what appears to be a suicide note. She's stable now, but it was close. The doctors think she'll make a full physical recovery, but the psychological damage is extensive. Emma felt an unexpected pang of guilt as she processed this information. She had intended to neutralize Jessica as a threat and protect future victims from harassment, but she had never wanted to drive the girl to attempt suicide. The weight of unintended consequences settled on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. "Why do you need me here?" Emma asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Because you're mentioned in the suicide note," Commander Mitchell replied quietly. "Not by name, but the references are clear enough that her parents and the hospital staff are asking questions. They want to understand what happened to their daughter that was traumatic enough to drive her to this point." Emma closed her eyes and leaned back against the car seat, trying to prepare herself mentally for whatever she was about to face. The bathroom confrontation had been a moment of self-defense that had expanded into a mission of protection for others. She had never considered that Jessica might internalize the defeat so completely that it would destroy her sense of self-worth entirely. They took the elevator to the psychiatric ward, where Emma was surprised to find that Jessica's parents had specifically requested to meet with her. Mr. and Mrs. Martinez were waiting in a family consultation room, their faces showing the kind of exhausted desperation that came from watching their child's world collapse around them. Mrs. Martinez looked up as Emma entered the room, her eyes red from crying but still sharp with the intelligence that had made her a successful businesswoman. "You're Emma Chen," she said, making it a statement rather than a question. Emma nodded, unsure of what she was supposed to say in this situation. "I'm sorry about Jessica," she offered, the words feeling inadequate but genuine. Mr. Martinez stood up from his chair, his tall frame imposing even in his current state of emotional distress. "We read her note," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "She wrote about a confrontation in a school bathroom where someone showed her what she really was. She said it was the moment she realized she was a monster who had been hurting innocent people for years." Emma felt her stomach clench as she realized the full scope of what had happened. Jessica hadn't just been defeated in their confrontation. She had been forced to confront the reality of her own behavior and found herself unable to live with that knowledge. The psychological warfare that Emma had learned to use against adult predators had been devastating when applied to a teenager who lacked the emotional maturity to process such complete moral failure. Jessica has been in therapy since that day, Mrs. Martinez continued, her voice breaking slightly. She told us about the things she had done to other students, the systematic harassment and humiliation. She said she couldn't sleep at night, knowing how much pain she had caused, how many lives she had damaged for her own entertainment. Emma sat down across from Jessica's parents, trying to process the unexpected complexity of the situation. She had assumed that Jessica would simply move on from their confrontation, perhaps finding new targets or new ways to exert power over others. She had never considered that the girl might develop genuine remorse, or that the weight of her past actions might become unbearable. "She asked us to find you," Mr. Martinez said, pulling out a handwritten letter that looked like it had been read many times. She wanted to apologize, to try to make amends for what she had done. But she also said she didn't think she deserved forgiveness, that she had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Emma read the letter carefully, noting the genuine anguish in Jessica's handwriting and the detailed catalog of her past victims that she had compiled in an apparent attempt to understand the full scope of her cruelty. The girl who had once seemed like a one-dimensional villain was revealed to be someone capable of profound self-reflection and genuine remorse. "Where is she now?" Emma asked quietly. "In her room," Mrs. Martinez replied. "She's awake, but she won't talk to anyone except the psychiatrist. She just stares at the ceiling and cries. The doctors say she's suffering from severe depression and post-traumatic stress related to confronting her own behavior patterns." Emma made a decision that surprised even herself. "I'd like to see her," she said, despite Commander Mitchell's sharp look of concern. The walk to Jessica's hospital room felt like a journey through Emma's own past, remembering the fear and helplessness she had felt when Jessica and her crew had seemed all-powerful and untouchable. Now the roles were completely reversed, with Jessica as the vulnerable one and Emma holding all the power in their relationship. Jessica Martinez lay in the hospital bed looking smaller and more fragile than Emma had ever seen her. The confident Queen Bee was gone, replaced by a broken girl whose eyes held the kind of haunted emptiness that came from staring too long into the abyss of her own soul. When she saw Emma enter the room, Jessica's reaction was immediate and devastating. "I'm sorry," Jessica whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry for everything I did to you, for everything I did to everyone. I know it doesn't matter now. I know sorry isn't enough, but I needed you to know that I understand what I was." Emma sat down in the chair beside Jessica's bed, studying the girl who had once been her tormentor. The physical transformation was striking, but the psychological change was even more profound. This was someone who had been completely broken by the realization of her own monstrosity, someone who had looked into her soul and found it so dark that she couldn't bear to continue living with that knowledge. "Why did you do it?" Emma asked, not referring to the suicide attempt, but to the months of harassment that had preceded their bathroom confrontation. Jessica closed her eyes, fresh tears leaking from beneath her lashes. "Because I could," she said simply. "Because it made me feel powerful to have control over other people's emotions. Because I was angry at my own life and taking it out on people who couldn't fight back was easier than dealing with my own problems." The honesty of the answer was both refreshing and heartbreaking. Emma had expected excuses or justifications, but Jessica seemed determined to own the full reality of her past behavior without attempting to minimize or rationalize it. "I made a list," Jessica continued, her voice barely audible. "Everyone I hurt, everything I did, all the ways I made other people's lives worse, because I enjoyed having that power. The list is 7 pages long, Emma. 7 pages of cruelty that I committed just because I could get away with it." Emma felt a complicated mix of emotions as she listened to Jessica's confession. Part of her felt vindicated that her former Tormentor finally understood the impact of her actions. But another part felt genuinely sorry for someone who was clearly suffering from the weight of her own guilt and shame. "What do you want from me?" Emma asked, keeping her voice neutral. Jessica opened her eyes and looked directly at Emma for the first time since she had entered the room. "I want you to know that what you did in that bathroom saved people," she said with quiet intensity. "Not just yourself, but everyone I would have hurt afterward. I was getting worse, Emma. The harassment was escalating, and I was planning things that would have destroyed lives permanently." The revelation sent a chill down Emma's spine as she realized how much worse the situation could have become if she hadn't finally stood up for herself. Jessica's descent into increasingly sadistic behavior might have continued until someone was seriously injured or driven to their own suicide attempt. "I also want you to know that I don't blame you for this," Jessica continued, gesturing weakly at the hospital room around them. "What I did to myself isn't your fault. It's the natural consequence of finally understanding what kind of person I had become. You held up a mirror, and I couldn't stand what I saw reflected back at me." Emma leaned forward in her chair, choosing her words carefully. "Guilt can be a teacher if you let it," she said, remembering something her father had told her about the importance of learning from mistakes. "The question is whether you're going to let it destroy you or use it to become someone better." Jessica's laugh was bitter and self-deprecating. "Better? Emma, I made people's lives hell for entertainment. I created trauma that some of those kids will carry for years. How do you come back from that? How do you build something good on a foundation of deliberate cruelty?" Emma considered the question seriously, thinking about everything she had learned during her months with the CDC about redemption, justice, and the possibility of genuine change. "You start by surviving," she said finally. "You get better. You leave the hospital, and you spend the rest of your life trying to balance the scales. Not because you expect forgiveness, but because it's the right thing to do." For the first time since Emma had entered the room, Jessica's expression showed something other than despair. It was a tiny spark of possibility, the faintest suggestion that there might be a path forward that didn't end in self-destruction. "The CDC has a program for people like you," Emma said, making a decision that she hoped she wouldn't regret. "Former bullies who want to make amends, people who have caused harm and want to spend their lives preventing others from making the same mistakes. It's not easy work, and it doesn't erase what you've done, but it's a way to use your experience to protect potential victims." Jessica stared at Emma in amazement, clearly unable to believe that she was being offered any kind of second chance. "You would trust me with something like that?" she asked incredulously. "I would trust you to understand the mindset of predators because you used to be one," Emma corrected. "I would trust you to recognize the warning signs because you exhibited them yourself. And I would trust you to fight harder than anyone else to prevent the kind of harm you once caused because you know exactly how it feels to be the monster in someone else's story." The conversation continued for another hour, with Emma explaining the basics of restorative justice and the possibility of channeling guilt into constructive action. When she finally left Jessica's hospital room, both girls had been changed by the encounter in ways that would take months to fully understand. Commander Mitchell was waiting in the hallway, her expression thoughtful as Emma emerged from the room. "How do you feel about what just happened in there?" she asked as they walked toward the elevator. Emma considered the question carefully, thinking about the complexity of human nature and the possibility of redemption, even for those who had caused significant harm. "I feel like my father would be proud," she said finally. "He always taught me that the strongest people are those who can extend mercy to their enemies while still protecting the innocent." As they drove away from the hospital, Emma reflected on how much her understanding of justice had evolved since that day in the third-floor bathroom. What had started as a simple matter of self-defense had grown into something much more complex, involving questions of rehabilitation, redemption, and the possibility that even the worst people might be capable of genuine change. 6 months later, Jessica Martinez was released from a residential treatment facility and began working as a peer counselor for teenagers who had been involved in bullying behavior. Her transformation wasn't complete or perfect, and she would carry the weight of her past actions for the rest of her life. But she had found a way to channel her guilt into something constructive, using her experience as a predator to help others recognize and change their own harmful patterns. Emma Chen continued her work with the CDC, but her approach had been subtly altered by her encounter with Jessica's redemption. She still protected the innocent and neutralized threats, but she also began looking for opportunities to offer former predators the chance to make amends through service to others. Not everyone deserved or wanted such opportunities, but for those who did, Emma had learned that mercy could be as powerful a weapon as any martial arts technique her father had taught her. The bathroom confrontation that had started everything remained a defining moment in Emma's life, but it was no longer the end of Jessica's story or the final word on what justice looked like. Instead, it had become the beginning of a more complex understanding of human nature and the possibility that even the darkest souls might contain sparks of light that could be nurtured into something beautiful. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.